Trials can test your trust. When things are going well, it's easy to be self-confident. But when you start to be attacked and battered, you ask questions about what matters most, questions about what you're depending upon. David wrote Psalm 62, our Psalm of the Week, while under attack. That's clear from verse 3. His enemies had battered him until he says he's like a leaning wall and a tottering fence, verse 3, ready to crash down at any moment. Liars were working hard to bring him down. They were blessing David with their mouths, but cursing him in their hearts. And that certainly took a toll on David. But in the midst of his pummeling, it's as if the fog lifted and his faith found greater clarity. Trials had tested his trust. He realized that God alone is worthy of trust. So he could say in verse 8, "Trust in him at all times, O people." Not just when things are going well, but when things are falling apart as well. Listen to David's resolve. Verses 1 and 5, he says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence." In verse 6 and verse 2, "He only is my rock and my salvation." Verse 7, "On God rests my salvation and my glory." You know, when the ice begins to crack beneath your feet, you make way for the shore, don't you? For the solid ground. You zero in on that solid place that your feet can rest upon. And that's what David's doing here. 3 times he calls God a rock, verse 2, verse 6, and verse 7, a solid place for his feet to rest. We have other choices, of course. We can trust in people. We often do. But David says in verse 9, "Those who are of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion," not adequate helpers. People are not worthy of our trust as God is. We could trust in wealth, and we sometimes do, even if we have to cut corners to gain it. But David, one of the richest people in the world at this time, warns, "If riches increase, set not your heart on them." Right? Riches had increased for David. He went from being a shepherd boy to the king of Israel, incredibly rich man. But it hadn't kept him, those riches hadn't kept him from attack and from being brought into this dark, hard place. Only God is both merciful and just, fully worthy of our trust. And here's a consequence in Psalm 62 of trusting in God. David says in verse 8, "Pour out your heart before him and wait in contented silence," verse 1, "for God to answer." Right? If we can trust God, then we can tell him all. We can pour out our hearts before him. We can pray to him with sincerity and transparency. Friend, don't whitewash your prayer. David's expressions aren't carefully guarded like ours are sometimes. They are the candid shrieks of a man in a pitched battle, right? He knows he's in trouble. He just cries out what his heart moves to his mouth. Take what is already in your heart and simply pour it out. That's what David says in verse 8. That means telling God your frustrations and your fears. Admit to him your weaknesses and failures. Confess misplaced trust. Those areas, people, riches, or whatever, which are drawing your trust away from God. And then tell him that you trust him if you do. That you believe, as David says in verse 11, that power belongs to God. And then as David does in Psalm 62, as he tells us from the first couple verses, then wait contentedly for God to work. Let's listen to Psalm 62. To the choir master, according to Jeduthun, a psalm of David. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will you all attack a man to batter him, like a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. Selah. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. For my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I will not be shaken. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work.